Hello students, this is Dr. Faizan Mirza. We are studying respiratory system, structure and function. We are discussing respiratory tract. So when we discuss respiratory tract, we have the various parts in this respiratory system. And the respiratory system begins with your nose. How many anatomical positions or anatomical distinct regions are there in the nose? That's what we are discussing here. So the respiratory tract involves your nose, the pharynx, the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and then bronchioles. Initially, let's discuss the anatomical parts of these respiratory tract passageways. Nose. Nose is having the nasal cavity followed by nasal conchae, and then you have nasal vestibule. These are the main parts of the nose. Pharynx is having three main regions: the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, depending on which part of your body the pharynx is in close proximity to. Larynx is then having these parts which include epiglottis, thyroid, cricoid cartilage. There are two cartilages here, cricoid cartilage and the thyroid cartilage, and then you have vocal folds. Then you have trachea followed by bronchi. Bronchi involves the superior bronchi, inferior and the middle bronchi for right and left lung each. Bronchioles then have these many parts. You have primary bronchioles, then secondary bronchioles, then you have tertiary bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, and finally respiratory bronchioles. This entire is your respiratory tract. The way one passageway leads to the other is regarded as generation of a family. So here a family is generated, one thing or one anatomical structure leads to another, and eventually you get a respiratory tree. This is generation of a family. We also use the term of dichotomous branching here. Dichotomous branching means that there is one trachea. This one trachea opens up into two bronchi. Then bronchi opens up again into two branches. Each branch will again have two further branches. So the way trachea eventually leads to respiratory bronchioles, this is your respiratory tree, where we discuss generation of a family that goes on by dichotomous branching. Overview of the histology of your respiratory tract. Which tissues are present in your respiratory system? We have mesothelium, which lines the pleural cavity. Your trachea, your bronchi, bronchioles, they are all lined by pseudo-stratified columnar epithelial cells. The alveoli and the alveolar duct, they are having simple squamous epithelium. Mucus producing cells, there are two types. You have goblet cells and mucous glands. Note the change in the spelling of mucus and mucous glands, although both are pronounced as mucus. Then we have basal cells, which replace and regenerate all these tissues by the process of mitosis. We have a squamous epithelial lining that lines the alveoli. And what type of cells do we have in alveoli? We have four distinct types. We have type 1, which allow gas exchange. Type 2 cells of alveoli release surfactant. Then there are dust cells which carry on macrophages property. And then there are something called as the septal cells as well. So probably you can just look up to what septal cells are. Here you can see how the generation of the family goes on. There are about 16 generations, and the last 7 generations, the last 7 months, these last 7 generations, they actually are, you can say, the respiratory zone, or the transition between the respiratory zone and the conducting airways. These are all the conducting airways. Conducting airway means that air is conducted through these parts, which means this letter Z also actually means generations. So this is a passageway conducting airway, trachea to the bronchi, then bronchi into bronchioles. You can see the dichotomous branching going on. You can see how the generation of the family continues, and eventually you have the transition between the conducting airways and the you can say the respiratory zones. The respiratory zones are the region where actual respiration will occur, which means the exchange will occur. So this primarily is the conducting zone, including trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and the terminal bronchioles. Whereas the respiratory bronchioles till alveolar ducts, this is, you can see that these are transitional and respiratory zones. Here you can see the conducting zone and respiratory zone airway generation, how we move on from 0 generation to 5th, then 10, then we go on further, and you can see how their total cross-sectional area, which is shown on the y-axis, it changes. The total cross-sectional area, you can see this increasing. So the respiratory zone is having a very high cross-sectional area, the total cross-sectional area, which increases the chances of the gas exchange that can occur very promptly. What is the purpose of having respiration? Why do we have respiration? Respiration allows exchange of gases, and this exchange of gases provide oxygen, which can be used for metabolic activities, for producing ATP, which is later used as an energy currency molecule. Starting off with nose. Nose, what functions is nose performing here? These functions include, it moistens the air, it warms the air, it filters the air. This combinedly is called as air conditioning. So the nose carry out the process of air conditioning. As the air gets warmed up, how it will get warmed up, by the way? As it passes along the large surface area of conchae and the septum and pharyngeal wall, it strikes with those. This area accounts for about 160 centimeters squared area. And the nose, when the air passes through all these structures, it gets warmed up. The nasal lining includes ciliated columnar epithelial cells, and they also include goblet cells, which release the mucus. This moistens up the air. So dry air, it may damage the trachea or the airway lining or the alveoli. So this is moistened air. It prevents the lining from getting too much dried up or getting damaged. Air is filtered using the action of the sweeping action of cilia, and all the particulate matter, most of it sticks to the mucus lining, which is released by the mucus producing cells. This is the nose. You can see how the air enters in your nose, and as it strikes with this anatomical structures present inside the nose, and this air changes direction, and then it goes down towards the lungs in your trachea. So as the air changes directions, you know that air being fluid, it changes direction at a very fast speed as it strikes with these regions within the nose. It changes its directions. So as the directions are changed further, this leads to the particulate matter getting settled down, because air being fluid changes direction faster as compared to particulate matter. Particulate matter starts to settle down, it starts to stick to the mucus or get filtered by the cilia. Once it is adhered to mucus, it is swept away by the ciliated lining, and it is then taken from the throat to the stomach. Particulate matter which are greater than 6 micrometer are the ones which cannot reach, which cannot get adhered here. So those which are smaller, the particulate matter which are about 6 micrometer, they actually greater than 6 micrometer, they settle in this way. But the ones which are smaller, for example 1 to 5 micrometer, they reach bronchioles, and they are adhered in bronchioles. And ones which are even smaller than 1 micrometer, the smallest ones, they would reach the alveoli, and they would be removed from that part using the those dust cells which are present in alveoli. Coal miners or people who work in flour factory, they suffer from bronchitis for the same reason, because they have a great deal of exposure to these particulate matter in the air that they are inhaling constantly. The next thing related to nose and the upper respiratory tract and the associated structures is vocalization. Vocalization is voice production. It includes phonation as well as articulation and resonations, or you can say resonators. So we need to discuss what phonation is, what articulation, and what resonators do. Vocalization, voice production, it's controlled by speech control center in your cerebral cortex together with the respiratory control center in your brain stem, as well as the articulatory structures present in your body, which we will just discuss shortly. Phonation occurs by larynx, which actually is your voice box, and this voice box is having vocal folds. The vocal folds, how do they function? During normal breathing, the vocal folds are wide, which means they are abduct, and they are opened. Air pass easily through them. But during phonation, when you are producing sound, the vocal folds, they close together, and when they close together, they become adduct, and air pass through them in a narrow chink. There's a narrow opening because of them closing together. So the vocal folds start to vibrate due to that sound production, and the sound is produced. How articulation helps and how resonators helps in vocalization. Articulation, the structures that include articulation that leads to articulation disease include lips, your tongue, your soft palate. Whereas the structures of your body that are acting as resonators, they include mouth, they include nose, chest cavity, nasal sinus, pharynx. And all these structures, the articulation and resonator structures, they modulate the voice quality and pitch. Airways. Already discussed the conducting airways. They must remain opened for easy passageway of air. We have seen which generations include the conducting airways. You can just recall those. The wall of trachea and these conducting airways, they have cartilage. Trachea is having C-shaped cartilage or an incomplete ring of cartilage. Cartilage prevents collapse of trachea, so these structures, they stay opened. And already discussed how this family or generation of the family occurs by dichotomous branching. One trachea leads to two bronchi and then bronchioles and so on and so forth. And this generation of the family eventually leads to respiratory bronchioles and eventually to the alveoli, where you have the gaseous exchange occurring. The main idea is to bring the inhaled air in close proximity to the blood supply, so gaseous exchange can occur between the alveolar air and blood. Trachea is regarded as zero generation, bronchi is first generation, and so on and so forth. Already covered the generation of the family and dichotomous branching, but you need to just recall those concepts. That's it for now. Thank you so much.